Hi, it's me. I think that we probably cut off in point number 4 in the lecture. So everybody has gone, but I wanted to just catch you up on the part that we missed. So this is point number 4, legal exclusion, but actual acceptance. So as time progressed, although there might have been legal things on the books, legal statutes on the books that excluded blacks from military service, it didn't mean that it actually meant that they didn't serve. Just because it wasn't officially on the books doesn't mean, this is point number 5, doesn't mean that they weren't serving. If there was an emergency, of course blacks would be brought forward. Free blacks volunteered, slaves were brought forward. It didn't mean that they weren't serving. Right? Because necessity, right? Necessity is the mother of invention, and it certainly was a case here. So they were still serving, even though they may have legally been excluded. And it's ironic, right? It's ironic to think, that they're excluded, and yet they are allowed to serve. It doesn't make any sense, and it's part of this whole civil rights issue that we've been talking about, both in lecture and in Eyes on the Prize. There are just so many ironies as we go through, and this is certainly one of those, to be sure. In the American War for Independence, point number 7, which took place between 1775 and 1781, I have service down there twice, A and B. Blacks served both in the British military. They were free blacks living in Great Britain, in London, in England, throughout the British Isles. They served in the British Army. There were also some free blacks who volunteered to serve in the British Army. If slaves could escape, they would serve in the British Army. There were blacks, obviously, that served in the American military as well, most often in the militia that was created. But they were serving on both sides. So again, just because they're legally excluded didn't mean that they weren't serving in that war, and serving with distinction and honor. Even though they were serving, it didn't mean, point number 8, that they were treated equal. Of course not. There was still inequity and injustice within the ranks on both the British side and the American side. Blacks were treated better in the British Army than they were in the American, but they were they were subject to mistreatment on either side, but more on one side than the other, I would say. Gradually, as blacks and whites did serve together over time, things got a little bit better. People got more used to serving with blacks and other minorities. They became more regular, I suppose. It didn't mean that they were accepted, but they got used to the service, if you follow what I'm saying. So skip to the 20th century and Jim Crow, and specifically want to look at pre-World War II. So World War II is breaks out in Europe in 1939, but here, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, of course, the United States gets in. So December 1941 through 1945 in the United States. And there were Jim Crow laws in the military. The military was segregated. All branches were segregated. So Army, Navy, they were segregated. They used different approaches. This is point number 2. They went about it differently. In the Army, of course, they segregated by units. So there were black units and there were white units. Of course, the black units were commanded by white officers. So it was easier, in one sense, if you will, that they would segregate that way. It didn't make any economic sense, of course, because you have separate everything. Separate training facilities, separate everything, separate barracks, separate latrines, separate medical facilities, separate. It didn't make any economic sense. The Navy was quite different. You're all on one ship, and blacks served on the lower decks. They were segregated by job, and whites served on the upper decks. So again, very different type of segregation between Army and Navy. Marines, they were the most resistant to integration, and even today, in 2018, the Marines have the lowest number of minority members serving in the Marines. It's still. It stays, it's a residue from prior centuries. They just don't have the numbers that the Air Force has, certainly that the Army has, and the Navy. The Air Force, however, was a new branch of government. It was created after the war, after World War II. This is point number 4. And they emerge as part of the Cold Wars that's going on in the latter part of the 1940s. A brand new branch. Now, the Army Air Corps is the predecessor to the Air Force, right? Air Force begins as part of the Army, again, the Army Air Corps. And by the end of the Second World War, it becomes very apparent that they're going to need to have their own branch of service. And so what happens is, of course, the Air Force is created, but it's created in this new era of integration. And point number 5, one of the driving forces behind the success of the Air Force initially with integration had to do with budget. And it became very clear very rapidly that if you integrated your service, if you integrated the Army, or if you integrated the Navy, or if you integrated the Air Force, you would get better budget, you would get more money, you would get better public relations, you would get better exposure, you would get access to all different types of things that would take you a longer time if you didn't integrate. And so the Air Force, in part led by point number 6, General James Doolittle, figured that out very early on and figured out, hey, let's integrate. Doolittle had served with blacks in his military service. He was a commander that ordered the air raid in Tokyo in World War II. He had blacks that were serving with him, and he felt blacks were just as capable as whites, and he saw this as a kind of a no-brainer. Let's bring them in. Let's give opportunities. So he did that, and he got larger share of the budget. He got everything that other services could have had, but they were more resistant, certainly. In 1948, point number 7, of course, we know that President Truman desegregated the military with an executive order, and eventually the other services will be forced to integrate. The Cold War brought new realities. Cold War, really 1949 to 1989, brought a lot more military realities that we had not seen before. It became very clear that prior to the war, women had a relatively small military, and during the war, it had to expand very rapidly. They had to get numbers. And then we demilitarized really quickly, right? After the war was over, we sent troops home, etc., etc. But it became very clear that there was another war going on. It was a Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union never directly fight each other, but instead they'd indirectly fight each other. North Vietnam, South Vietnam, North Korea, South Korea, and all different sorts of places across Europe and other areas around the world. So we needed a different type of military, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. At the same time, of course, in the early 50s, we've got cases like Brown versus Board of Education that are being decided, where there's desegregation in public schools, which is going to not just be public schools, but any public accommodation. And those cases are going to certainly have their impact on the military as well, because people serving the military, they have children, and they go to school. And so there will be this integration happening in those parts of their lives as well. Point number 10, public attitudes after the Second World War were beginning to change across the nation. It took a little while in some places, and certainly in the Deep South, the longest, right? And in some places in the Deep South, one could argue, maybe not fully integrated even today in 2018. Military, this is point number 11, military realities called for an increased military force in terms of size. We had to have a larger military. Second World War had proven that. We fought not one but two fronts, in the Pacific, of course, against Japan, and also in Europe against Germany. We definitely needed to increase our military size, and the way that we had recruited, certainly in Vietnam and in Korea, was the draft. that didn't work out very well. So we're going to have to change the way that we are fashioning our military, so to speak. There would be resistance to social revolution within the military. This is point number 12. It was an ongoing theme, and among those at the highest ranks, General Eisenhower was very resistant. He was resistant as president. We saw this when he was backed into a wall by the Supreme Court's decision in 1954 to integrate public schools. He was backed into a wall, and he was forced to send 1,100 paratroopers into Little Rock Central High School. He was really forced to do that. And so we see even at the highest leadership levels that there is still resistance. But I'll just chat about bases and communities in which Army bases or Army posts and Air Force bases are located. They're part of community, right? And so if the civil rights movement was happening in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s outside of a military installation, it's going to trickle into that military installation, again, through schools, through spouses who had jobs outside of the military installation. They're going to bring things in. There were military spouses who took part in marching, who took part in driving maids and spots that were very active in pursuing civil rights for African Americans and other minorities. There were those people who were very much involved. And so even though the military is separate, there's the trickle-in effect and the trickle-out effect as well. There was a project during Vietnam. It was called, this is point number 15, Project 100,000. And specifically, this project looked at bringing more African Americans into the military. Again, we need a larger military, and we need it to be a volunteer basis, and so we needed more numbers. And there was a project, and it was called Project 100,000, and it was led by Robert McNamara, letter B. He was the Secretary of Defense. And he thought that the military would be a great opportunity for anybody, regardless of race, to come in. You'd get free housing, you would have education, you'd gain skills, and get specialized training that could be used outside of the military. And so he sought actively to recruit from lower income places throughout the country, which tended to translate into places that had high percentage of African Americans. So a number of African Americans, a high number percentage, were recruited during that time under this program and in different programs as well. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is that these people typically ended up serving in combat infantry units in Vietnam and disproportionately were killed at higher rates than whites. Definitely unintended consequences, I would think. I don't think that was Robert McNamara's intention. I think that it was an unintended consequence. And it's a very sad consequence, right? It was his project, letter C, to help train and enhance the skills of people who were economically disadvantaged. Unfortunately, the reactions to realities was that people got into the military that way. Unfortunately, like I said, killed disproportionately or injured disproportionately to white counterparts. This was blacks and other minorities that were involved in Project 100,000. It did provide leadership skills and training and management skills, which translated into jobs outside. There was a sociologist named Charles Moskos, who was at the University of Chicago, who did studies that showed, yes, that if you're in the military, you will in fact emerge with these leadership skills, and that people would make great managers and great supervisors and that kind of thing. So there was genuine research that showed that McNamara's experiment had some basis in that. And then I have these conclusion remarks. One, experience in the military mirrored a wider society to a great degree. Military, as you know, does not exist in a vacuum. Leadership within society and within the ranks, dealing with desegregation and integration, it just required and continues to require more and more leadership. And finally, the role of military in providing leadership skills to African Americans, which they can take with them into a broader society, and particularly post-Vietnam. So there you go. I hope you got most of that.